They're the smallest handful of characters and mascots that anyone could safely say are globally ubiquitous. I bet every single person watching this video right now would think of the exact same thing if I simply said yellow mouse. If you have a good idea at the right place and the right time, you could have something truly magical on your hands. And that's exactly what happened in 1954 when Eiji Tsuburaya and Ishiro Honda released Godzilla into the world, kickstarting the kaiju genre and a global phenomenon. The original Japanese film, Gojira, both served as a metaphor for the horrors of nuclear war and a warning to humanity to never put themselves above nature. Godzilla himself and the destruction he brought served as a not-so-subtle allegory for the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was a dark, harrowing film that kickstarted the longest-running film franchise of all time, spanning 38 films, not including spin-offs, and I've seen them all. Next to the aforementioned yellow mouse, Godzilla has had the longest standing and biggest impact on my life, to the point where I actually have his name tattooed on me in katakana. Can you see it? It goes down. Now, I'm not using this whole video to gush about one of my favorite and probably most confusing franchises to an outsider ever, but I wanted to bring this up because in April 2020, two of my favorite things of all time collided. Godzilla and a select roster of monsters from Toho Studios were brought into Magic: The Gathering, of all things, for Ikoria: Lair of the Behemoths. They put the King of the Kaiju in the Kaiju set, and I was extremely stoked. This video happens to be dropping in December 2024, which not only happens to be the very first year that Godzilla had won an Oscar for Godzilla Minus One, it also happens to be the monster's 70th birthday. So I figured now would be a great time to revisit those cards from Ikoria and see if they actually match the monsters that they're portraying and see if I could make changes in any way to make them fit better. There were 19 cards printed in this collaboration with Toho. Dubbed the Godzilla series, it was actually the first time that characters from outside of Magic were brought into the game. It actually predates Universes Beyond by a couple of months. It just made so much sense for Wizards to bring in the King of the Monsters into the set that was heavily inspired by those films. Now, some people weren't actually into these variants as they depicted art that featured office buildings and jet planes and stuff like that. Stuff that was decidedly not Magic: The Gathering. But thankfully, each one of these cards being variants, you could find in-universe versions in the set just by pulling packs. All of them except for one, but we'll get to that. Being the first iteration of anything can come with some growing pains, and the Godzilla series was no different. A lot of the Godzilla series cards were printed as variants as the most powerful creatures in the set, and a lot of those creatures happen to have the Mutate ability, which was Ikoria's cornerstone mechanic. Mutate is an ability that has players stacking creatures on top of each other to borrow power and toughness and abilities, and make one strong singular monster out of a bunch of little creatures. While I do really like the Mutate mechanic from Ikoria, it doesn't actually make a lot of sense within the context of Godzilla. Mutation does happen, but it's more of a scientific thing. You're not seeing a lot of different smaller creatures combine in order to make one big one. Not always. There are a couple exceptions. Actually, one of the monsters that fits this description really well is Orga from Godzilla 2000, and he's not even in this set. He's a monster that literally tries to swallow Godzilla whole in order to become a mutant clone of him. No, I'm not kidding. It's wild. So if Ikoria's version of Mutate doesn't make much sense here, how do we fix these cards? Let's start with the cards that don't have Mutate and then circle back around, as those are going to be a little bit easier to change. Let's start with the man of the hour himself, Godzilla, King of the Monsters. This card was released as the Buy a Box promo for the set and was a variant of Zilortha, Strength Incarnate. Now, I said not all of the cards were available in-universe in Ikoria, and Zilortha is that one exception. For some reason, it was left out of the set and didn't actually see print until 3 years later in Commander Masters. The in-universe version of Zilortha was actually available on Arena before it was officially printed, but even that was released after Ikoria. I don't know why this guy keeps getting left out of stuff, but we got him eventually. The art on Godzilla King of the Monsters depicts him as he was in the Heisei era, which lasted from 1984 to 1995. This era is famous for having one continuous storyline, and it actually features most of the monsters in the Godzilla series, as well as the hardest movie posters you will ever see. Look at these things. Oh my god. Now, Godzilla's design has had a lot of iterations over the years, but the Heisei Godzilla is quintessential for me. Like I said, the Heisei era featured a continuous storyline, so his look really didn't change throughout that entire series. In a lot of other films, his design will change from film to film. In this series, he's depicted as a force of nature. He's actually a mutated Godzillasaurus that is found on an island in the Pacific during World War II. Nuclear testing after the war on that island eventually gave us this Godzilla. But it's worth pointing out that the original 1954 Godzilla did also exist in these films, but was killed off. And this Godzilla is a brand new monster altogether. It becomes pretty apparent during this series that he takes the best defense is a strong offense approach to fighting. So I think Zilurtha is actually a really great start to his card. Seeing as he is the one and only Godzilla though, I would definitely push this card a little further. I think we can drop the mana cost by 1 and make him 2 red-green, as I think Gruul actually makes a ton of sense for him. I feel like we should also have a way to power him up because that happens a couple of times throughout the Heisei films. So we could just kind of cop out and give him fire breathing, or we could give him a fling effect that is a lot more on flavor. You can sacrifice a creature and give him +X/+0 until the end of turn, where X is the sacrificed creature's power. There are a couple of times where monsters give up their own energy or life force to power him up in order to defeat the bad guy. So this makes perfect sense for him. I do only want to let him use this ability once per turn though, as this could get out of hand really fast and have him be kind of a one-man Craterhoof behemoth of sorts. Overall, I think the design team went with the best option that they had available for Godzilla. Alright, we've talked about the king, now let's talk Mothra, Supersonic Queen. Mothra is arguably the most popular kaiju next to Godzilla, and has appeared in the second most amount of films in the franchise by far. She's not only unique for being one of the only insect kaiju period, she's also the only monster that is always good no matter what, and is a benevolent deity that fights to protect Earth and humanity. The rest of the monsters have a tenuous relationship with humanity at best. She's always accompanied by 2 tiny priestesses called the Shobijin, who kind of act as her mouthpiece to speak to humanity on her behalf. In most of her film appearances, she goes through the different stages of a moth's life cycle, usually entering the film when somebody finally discovers her egg. Almost like clockwork, she'll hatch soon after the discovery and spend most of the first half of the film in her larval stage. She'll then typically have one pretty big fight and then go into a cocoon to become a moth for the second half of the movie. The art depiction itself doesn't matter that much for Mothra because her appearance actually hasn't really changed all that much, with some slight tweaks in between the different eras. But this one, because of how fluffy it is, it's clearly the Heisei era as well. If you watch a couple of her films in a row, it might seem weird at first that she always ends up as an egg in the very beginning, even when some characters who have seen her from previous films know who she is. But it's implied that she's kind of like a phoenix. When she dies, she always ends up going back into an egg and the cycle continues. And she dies kind of a lot. Like, most of the time, she'll end up sacrificing herself at some point in the movie to try to defeat the big bad. I guess she can be a little bit more risky than the other monsters because she knows she's just going to come back, and Godzilla is likely gonna pull a win out of his ass anyway. Of course, he does it for his queen. Luminous Broodmoth was the perfect fit for Mothra. It even references her reincarnation by bringing other creatures back that die with flying counters on them. The card really is a good depiction of her final form, but we can definitely push this one further. First of all, after everything I just told you, the card isn't legendary. Let's make her legendary and add God to her creature type, because she is. Next, I'm keeping the Luminous Broodmoth effect as I really like that she can bring creatures back from the graveyard, but she doesn't have a way to bring herself back, which is what we're going to be adding. We could use something really easy like Persist or Undying to bring her back, but I want to make this as flavorful as possible. So what we're going to do is take the O'Hare treatment from Rivals of Ixalan. She'll be double-sided, and when she dies, she'll return to the battlefield transformed as her egg, which instead of a land is going to be an indestructible artifact, because that makes a lot more sense. The egg can tap for white, and when a creature with flying dies, you can tap 2 and a white to transform her back into her moth form. Unfortunately, the design space doesn't really allow for 3-stage transformations. So if you wanted to do her larva instead of her egg, you can make her a 2/2 with hexproof instead of indestructible and keep all of the same abilities. Because of how the films normally work, I was thinking about starting her in her lesser form, whether it be larva or egg. But because we don't have a way to guarantee that we have a flying creature in order to die, I want her to start in her moth form so she can give something flying before she dies at some point. Speaking of flying, let's talk Dorat, the perfect pet. I was honestly a little bit surprised to see these guys in the set. They only appear in one film, 1991's Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, and for the most part, they're just a plot device. The Dorats are from the future and were brought to the present day by the Futurians. This secretly evil organization brought them to the present day in order to try to rewrite history. They knew about the origin of Godzilla and how he was a dinosaur on an island in the Pacific that was exposed to radiation. So their plan was to take the Godzillasaurus off the island before the radiation hits and replace him with the Dorats to create King Ghidorah in order to use that monster to conquer the planet. We'll get to King Ghidorah pretty soon because I don't think I would actually change anything about this card. I really don't see any other way to depict these guys, as they're these adorable little pet creatures that eventually grow really big. And that's exactly what this card does. Although I guess if we were really pushing the flavor, we could add like a Shadowborn Apostle type effect and let you sacrifice 3 Dorats in order to search your library for a King Ghidorah card and put it onto the battlefield. But that's really it. This is a pretty spot-on depiction. I also didn't want to make this another transform card because King Ghidorah only mutates from these guys in exactly one movie, and every other time he's just an alien from space. The changes to these first 3 cards came so quick to me that they essentially got vomited out while I was writing the script. The rest of them are going to need a little bit more work. There are also 4 cards I'm going to be leaving out from the set. Those being King Shisa, Ancient Guardian, Space Godzilla, Death Corona, Godzilla Primeval Titan, and Mothra's Great Cocoon. We already talked about Godzilla and Mothra, and King Shisa and Space Godzilla have way more interesting and flavorful cards coming up. With that out of the way, since we already talked about the Dorats, it's time for Ghidorah, King of the Cosmos.
It's also time to subscribe!
What is he king of anyway? Well, he's a 3-headed, 2-tailed golden dragon from outer space that breathes lightning. I'd say he can be king of whatever he wants. Except for Earth, because whenever Godzilla sees him, it is on sight. Ghidorah has gone through a lot of iterations over the years, but in most cases, he's an alien monster sent to Earth by an alien race in order to conquer the world. He is also always Godzilla's arch rival. Every time they're in a movie together, those two are going to have the final battle against each other. This version of Ghidorah is from Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah and is the one that got mutated from the Dorats. Onto the card, I like Illuna, but none of this makes any sense for King Ghidorah. I do like that it's a 6/6 flying trample creature for 6, but that's about all we're keeping. First of all, King Ghidorah isn't from Earth, so we're going to take the green and replace it with black. I think Grixis makes a lot more sense for his color identity. We're going to keep the cost the same though. Ghidorah's creature type needs to change because it makes sense for Illuna, but 0 sense for King Ghidorah. Let's make him an elemental dragon. None of the printed abilities are staying because none of them feel like they make a lot of sense for King Ghidorah, but we are taking inspiration from a different magic card. The magic card that immediately came to mind when I had this idea was Drakuseth, Maw of Flame, because it deals 3 damage to 3 different targets when it
attacks.
So we're going to take that and we're going to push it. So as a static ability, Any damage dealt by King Ghidorah that would cause a creature or planeswalker to die, you exile it instead. And when it enters the battlefield, it deals 3 damage to up to 3 different targets. He's going to swoop in and make a very loud statement. And him dealing 3 damage is actually kind of an Easter egg. Since Godzilla has 3 toughness, that ability should kill him, but because of Godzilla's static ability, it won't. King Ghidorah has never taken Godzilla down, and I don't think he ever will. Before we get into the next monster, I want to talk about the different eras I keep mentioning, as it's a little bit more than timeline categorization. I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes version of each of them because there's actually a lot that we could go into with this. All Godzilla films can be categorized into 4 different eras, starting with the Showa era. This one starts with the original 1954 Godzilla film and ends in 1975 with Terror of Mechagodzilla. This era is known for its lower budgets and steering more towards kid-friendly themes over time. The next one is the Heisei era that I already covered from 1984 to 1995. This is a continuous story that's a little darker and grittier. Then comes the Millennium era from 1999 to 2004. These films feel a lot like anime and feel like they actually take from the contemporary anime of that time. Finally, we have the Reiwa era, which started in 2016 and is still going to this day. This final era has been defined by bold experimentation, with Toho bringing in directors and effects teams that have never worked on a Godzilla film before and letting them really run wild with ideas. We'll talk about it in depth a little later because it's really worth going into. Next, it's time to shift from Godzilla's arch rival to his best friend, with Anguirus, Armored Killer, the best boy from the Showa era. A lot of Godzilla's allies partner with him out of respect or necessity in order to bring a big bad villain down. Anguirus is one of the only monsters that in the films is described as Godzilla's friend. Ironically, he is the first monster that Godzilla ever fought, though, in 1955's Godzilla Raids Again. But ever since then, they've been best buds. He's a lot smaller than the other monsters, and doesn't have any real special powers to speak of, unless you count him curling up and turning into the deadliest soccer ball ever. Despite his obvious disadvantages, he's tenacious and has no problem going one-on-one with monsters that are way bigger than he is. His card is pretty good for the most part. I really like the 3 and a green for a 4/4 trample reach creature, but we're gonna push it a little bit. First off, his creature type should be dinosaur because look at him. I would take off the mutate and give him hexproof instead, and when he enters the battlefield, destroy target artifact or enchantment. This way he can offer support to the other monsters or put himself in a position to take on whatever's on the battlefield. Also, him being a green creature and us changing King Ghidorah's colors means that he's never helping King Ghidorah out, which is pretty on flavor. Rounding out Godzilla's allies, we have Rodan, Titan of Winged Fury. He appeared in multiple Showa-era films alongside Godzilla, starting with 1964's Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster. He eventually returned in the Heisei era in 1993's Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, as he's depicted here. His main unique power is his Mach 3 speed, which he flies so fast he creates a shockwave beneath him, destroying anything in his path. He typically will try to use that, along with the spikes on his chest, to swoop down on enemies during combat to try to take him off guard. The Titan of Winged Fury card has basically the exact casting cost and power and toughness that I'd give him, but he's definitely not a cat, so that has to go. Elemental also isn't a good fit either, so if I had to give him any creature types, it'd be Dinosaur Bird. I would give him the full Lightning Angel treatment as he's known for his speed, so we're gonna add haste to his flying and first strike. The triggered ability on the Mutate card makes a lot of sense in those colors, but I want to make this feel like Rodan. So when he attacks, you can tap 2 creatures an opponent controls, and those creatures don't untap during that player's next untap step. Not super broken, but definitely powerful. Baby Godzilla, despite the name, is not Godzilla's son, nor is he Minya from the Showa era. This monster is actually a vegetarian offshoot of the Godzillasaurus that our main Godzilla mutated from. Godzilla ends up fully adopting Baby at the end of Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2 and remains a father figure to him throughout the rest of the Heisei era. When he hatches in his debut film, he's not much bigger than a person. But by the next film, in 1994's Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla, he is just as big and adorable as you see on the art on the card. He's a silly little guy who is completely unable to defend himself at any point in the film, but it's totally fine because his dad is usually right around the corner to come rescue him. Him being a 1/3 makes a lot of sense, but he's not a frog or blue. We can fix this one pretty easily and change him into a 1 and a green dinosaur who reduces the cost of other dinosaurs instead of creatures with mutate. We can also change his second ability to draw a card every time you play a dinosaur. He's there to support and can't really do much else. Who can do the most, on the other hand, is Space Godzilla, a monster from space that was born from Godzilla cells that ended up in the atmosphere. Godzilla's cells, referred to as G cells throughout most of the movies, have rapid regenerative abilities and become a topic of a lot of the conversations the humans have in the Heisei films. Space Godzilla is a perfect example of these G cells getting completely out of control. He is a highly intelligent being with a lot of tricks up his sleeve to use in combat, and will readily shape the battlefield in his favor to defeat other monsters. We've seen him spawn crystals out of the ground to use as energy conduits like the ones on his shoulders. We've seen him create a temporary shield when Godzilla tried to blast him early in the film. He also uses the very unfortunately named Corona Beam that seems like, based on how it hits its targets, has homing capabilities. And he can pick up other monsters with his mind. He can also fly. He's a lot. And like other Sultai commanders, we're gonna make him a lot. I like him as the 6/6 Sultai creature with trample. We can keep him Sultai even though he's from outer space because he has Godzilla's DNA in him, so the green totally works. He's definitely black, and the tricks up his sleeve make him feel very blue. I like the creature types here because calling him a nightmare beast just kind of feels correct. I'm taking away the elemental though because that doesn't feel like it makes much sense. The name BioQuartz Space Godzilla is also not my favorite. So we're going to take the name from the altered version of the black card that you can find on Magic Online and name him Space Godzilla Void Invader. I'm not giving him flying, even though I probably should, because this thing is going to get really busted. To represent his shield, we're going to give him Ward 2. But I had a lot of trouble actually thinking how I wanted to portray him otherwise, as the original card's interaction with the graveyard doesn't make a lot of sense for Space Godzilla. I also wanted to keep his color identity intact. I had thought originally about generating tokens to act as the crystal conduits, but that didn't feel quite right to me. So I came up with this. When he or another creature enters the battlefield, you can exile an instant or sorcery in a graveyard with a conduit counter on it. Once per turn, you may cast a card exiled with a conduit counter on it, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast that spell. This ability could get very scary, and that's on purpose. Not only are you able to shape the battlefield based on other cards in the graveyard, you can also eliminate cards from an opponent's graveyard if they have a graveyard strategy. Even though it feels like it's probably pretty degenerate, I'm really happy with how this design came out. Space Godzilla isn't the first monster in the Heisei series to be created from G cells. That would actually go to Biollante, plant beast form. She's a monster created by a mad scientist from Godzilla cells, Rose cells, and the cells of his dead daughter. Biollante first appears in the film in her flower beast form, which resembles a giant rose and only can really attack by wrapping things in her vines. After a brutal beating from Godzilla early in the film, she dissipates into energy spores and goes up into the atmosphere, healing herself and changing into Biollante plant beast form. This form is a colossal alligator-faced monster with just the most teeth you'll ever see in your life. She moves around using numerous tendrils shifting through dirt, as it doesn't really look like she has a bottom half at all. She's a lot faster than you'd think she'd be moving this way, and along with her tendrils that now have mouths of their own and her acid spray breath, she really does a number on Godzilla. She is extremely tough, and perfect as an Abzan creature. Once again, very much not a cat, so she's a plant nightmare beast now. Death Touch and Lifelink make a lot of sense on her, so we're leaving those. But we're gonna make her a 6/6, as that seems to be the recurring thing with the Heisei villains. My first thought was to make her double-sided, but I wanted to play with the graveyard a little bit, and she only ever transforms out of the Rose Beast form one time throughout the movie, and it doesn't seem like she ever would have a reason to go back to her lesser form. So you may cast Biollante from the graveyard anytime you can play a sorcery, and while she's on the field, you can play land cards from your graveyard. This card ended up being pretty flavorful even without the Flower Beast form, and I'm pretty happy with it. We're just about done with the Heisei era with 2 monsters left, but I want to save one for later because you'll see why. Let's look at Batra, Dark Destroyer, which I'm sure you could have guessed by the way that he looks, is essentially an evil counterpart to Mothra. He made his debut in 1992's Godzilla vs. Mothra. As you could have guessed, Batra and Mothra are lifelong enemies, fighting each other since ancient times, who finally put away their differences and their complete opposite takes on humanity to defeat a rampaging Godzilla. He has pretty similar powers to Mothra, but can also fire beams in his moth form or his larva form. We first meet him in his larva form after a meteor crashes to Earth, and when he finally changes into his moth form, it's more like a Pokemon evolution with beams of light and everything. His larva form is actually one of my favorite kaiju designs ever, so we're definitely giving him the double-sided treatment. He's going to start in his larva form as a 3/3 insect god with Death Touch for 3 and a black. He can also tap for a black like Mothra's lesser forms can tap for white, and when he leaves the battlefield for any reason, he comes back transformed. Once he transforms, he becomes a 4/4, gains flying, and when he enters, each opponent discards 3 cards and loses 3 life. His hatred of humanity exceeds beyond the battlefield. Let's move on to the Millennium Era, as there's only a few cards here. We'll start with the monster that has been in every single era so far, Mechagodzilla. The version depicted on the card art debuted in 2002 in Godzilla Against Mechagodzilla, and this version is actually referred to as Kiryu. It's depicted as a defensive weapon created by Japan using the bones of the original Godzilla from 1954. If grave-robbing bones to make a death machine sounds like a bad idea to you, you'd be correct. The original Godzilla's spirit will occasionally wake up and go on a rampage, and there is kind of no way to really stop it until the robot runs out of juice. It's kind of cool to think about because since Kiryu is technically the original Godzilla, this movie and the follow-up, Tokyo SOS, are the only 2 films that have multiple full-on Godzillas in them. As you can see on the art, this thing is packed to the brim with artillery, and Crystalline Giant was actually a really great start for this, but we can focus this up a lot more. My first instinct was to make it a vehicle, but since the spirit of the original Godzilla can take over, we're just going to make it a legendary artifact creature. And its creature type will be a construct since it's man-made. I like the idea of attaching a lot of things to it for it to use as artillery, but we're going to move away from counters and go for equipment. I really liked the idea of a colorless equipment-focused creature, so when he enters, you may attach any number of equipment that you control to it. Then you can tap it in order to deal damage equal to twice the amount of equipment attached to Kiryu to any target. So either you attack and presumably deal big damage, or you can tap him and deal damage from afar. And we're keeping it a 3/3 because with all of the equipment attached to him, he's going to be a lot bigger than that. Keeping with the mechanical theme, next up is Gigan, Cyberclaw Terror. Gigan made a brief appearance in the 70s with only 2 films, Godzilla vs. Gigan and Godzilla vs. Megalon, but he's been such a fan favorite and a production studio favorite for such a long time that they brought him back for 2004's Godzilla Final Wars. At first, he had a rounder appearance with green skin and gold scales, but when he was brought back, he was given a major overhaul into the sleek, cybernetic monster you see on the card. He fights a lot dirtier than other monsters, and routinely will just kick opponents while they're down. He's also a bit of a hothead, and kinda has no problem abandoning ship if the fight isn't going his way, even leaving his allies to die. In contrast to most of the other villains, It looks like he's having fun destroying everything. It doesn't look like there's a clear purpose to what he's actually doing. His hot-headedness routinely backfires on him, and in Godzilla Final Wars, he actually kicks the bucket from his own hubris, and goes down in one of the funniest ways I've ever seen a kaiju die. Does this guy sound blue at all to you? Because he's not. There's nothing about him that's blue. We're making him Rakdos. This guy could be a Rakdos general, like the actual guild in Ravnica Rakdos general. I'm going to keep him as a 6-mana 6/6 with 4 colorless and 2 Rakdos hybrid mana instead. I think Demon as a creature type for him is hilarious, so we're keeping that. But we're also going to be adding Cyborg from the unsets because he is literally the Cyborg Kaiju. We're giving him Death Touch and Haste and kind of a Punisher ability. Whenever Gigan attacks, the defending player may sacrifice a creature. If that player doesn't, Gigan gains double strike until the end of turn. He's supposed to be brutal to fight against, and we're leaning into that. I would not want to be on the receiving end of his attacks. Rounding out the Millennium Era is King Shisa, Awoken Titan. Yes, you heard me right, it's pronounced Shisa, not Caesar, not Caesar, and definitely not Seesaw like this idiot thought. King Shisa is, well, a giant Shisa, which is a Japanese mythological beast that is basically a dog lion. He acts as a guardian to the island of Okinawa, and specifically the Izumi royal family from there. They're the only ones that can wake him up and use a song to do so. Although it's never mentioned in his first appearance in Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla in 1974, or his final depiction in Godzilla Final Wars 30 years later, he's actually a mythical construct of sorts. The only actual source that we have for this information is the Godzilla Monster Diagram Super Encyclopedia, officially released by Toho. Apparently, he has bones made of gold and a gem in his head that acts as both his brain and his energy source. He's known for being super agile and athletic. He kind of fights like a professional wrestler more than a monster. His moves are pretty calculated. His supernatural power is called Prismatic Eyes, which is shockingly not a magic card. He can essentially take the energy of a beam fired at him and fire it back at the opponent with 10 times the power, according to the encyclopedia. That second ability is cool as hell, and I definitely want to include it, but 10 times the power is a little much for a card game, but I like a lot of the original card, so I'm going to keep the casting cost and the power and toughness. We're going to change the creature type to Cat Warrior Construct, as it feels right and it's an excuse to get a deep lore reference in. To reference the Prismatic Eyes, whenever King Shisa is targeted by a spell or ability an opponent controls, it deals damage equal to that spell or permanent's mana value to that opponent. It's not countering the spell, it's just punishing the player that tried to get the best of him, and I think that's pretty cool. Now, I said I was saving the final Heisei monster for later, and here it is. Without further ado, Destroya, Perfect Life Form. In the immortal words of the angry video game nerd,
he looks like the goddamn devil.
Destroya is the final enemy of the Heisei series from Godzilla vs. Destroya in 1995. He is a living incarnation of the Oxygen Destroyer used to kill the original Godzilla in 1954. He also sets the record for the largest number of forms out of any kaiju, with 6 total. He's kind of like a mirror to the original Godzilla in a way. He starts effectively from dust and then grows into one of the biggest creatures we've ever seen. He really is the perfect bookend to this long story. Now, I'm going to put a timestamp here because there are major spoilers ahead. I know I've talked about the plot of a lot of the other movies in this video, but this one is pretty significant for kind of a huge reason. And if you don't want to be spoiled, if you're looking to watch these eventually, skip ahead to this time. Godzilla has only canonically died twice. Once in the original movie from 1954, and Godzilla vs. Destroya. Godzilla's heart is described as kind of a nuclear reactor that's been exposed to way too much excess nuclear energy and is currently in nuclear meltdown. It gives him a massive power boost, but you can see he's glowing orange and emitting steam. He's kind of fallen apart here. According to the scientist in this film, he's reaching the end of his life. And when he dies, his heart is going to melt down like a nuclear reactor and cause what they think is going to be a black hole that will swallow the entire galaxy. They come up with a couple of different plans to try to mitigate the damage here. Their first plan is to actually lure Godzilla and Destoroyah together and have Destoroyah kill him before he reaches the peak. What they didn't account for was the presence of baby Godzilla, who's now referred to as Godzilla Jr., because the excess radiation made him grow in size, and he's now basically a smaller Godzilla. That might sound like an unfair fight for Destoroyah, but he's evil and sadistic and actually ends up killing Godzilla Jr. right in front of the big guy. Godzilla and his new enemy number one have a brutal battle, and Destoroyah kinda just seems like he's enjoying it the whole time, which feels pretty messed up to watch. Although neither of them fully submit to the other in battle, it ends up being too late. Godzilla fully starts to melt down, and in a last-ditch effort to save the world, the military employs freezer weapons to try to freeze him enough to where he doesn't reach a high enough temperature to fully melt down. Because Destoroyah is born of the oxygen destroyer, his weakness also is extreme cold as well, so the military ends up firing at him and making him crash to the ground and explode before he can fly away. Godzilla starts to fall apart against some of the saddest music that you'll ever hear, until his exposed skeleton is all that's left, and then that crumbles. And you think it would go to cut to black, but it doesn't. In the darkness, a silhouette in front of the blue glow of the frost starts to appear. Godzilla Jr. absorbed all of the radiation that occurred during the meltdown, and this not only resurrected him, but made him fully evolve into the new Godzilla. That ending goes so much harder than it has any right to. Seriously, my description doesn't do it any justice. Let's take a breather and kind of put this ending into perspective though. I already mentioned that throughout the Heisei era, Godzilla has gone through a couple of necessary power-ups in order to take down the big bads. Usually, these power boosts mean absolute death to anyone that opposes Godzilla. But Destoroyah, who fought Godzilla when he was supposedly at his maximum power, would have gotten away if it weren't for military interference. Which means if Godzilla weren't on a timer, there is absolutely a world in which Destoroyah killed Godzilla and became top dog of the planet. That is absolutely terrifying to think about. With all of that in mind, how the hell does this card represent Destoroyah at all? This is going to be the one and only complete rewrite because this just doesn't make any sense to me. Except the flying, I guess that can stay. First of all, this guy should be mono black. There's just no way around it. He's pure evil. Also, definitely not a 4/4 for 4. That's just simply underpowered for what he is. I'm gonna match Godzilla at 7/7 for 4 black. The creature type being Nightmare Beast because look at him. When he enters, each player is gonna discard their hand and then draw cards equal to the lowest number of cards discarded this way. And when he attacks, defending player loses life equal to Destoroyah's power. You're going to feel his wrath. Okay, we're down to the final monster, and if you're still here, like and subscribe. I wanted to start and end this video with the king himself, so I'm going to present to you the most unique take on Godzilla we've ever had, Godzilla Doom Inevitable. This is the scariest incarnation of Godzilla we've ever had, in my opinion, and he appears in 2016's Shin Godzilla, directed by Hideaki Anno, which, if you somehow don't know, also directed Neon Genesis Evangelion. This is the film that kickstarted the Reiwa era, which, as I mentioned before, is the most experimental time that we've ever had for Godzilla. Each project has varied wildly in tone, from the cynical take on bureaucracy in Shin Godzilla to the literally physicist-turned-sci-fi author-written Godzilla Singular Point that is a complete head trip. It's also probably a good time to mention the American-made MonsterVerse films. These have nothing to do with the Reiwa era at all and are considered its own completely separate thing. Shin Godzilla was the first time in the entire film franchise that the original 1954 Godzilla film wasn't canon. That original Godzilla did not exist in this movie's timeline, And instead, the monster we're looking at is actually a marine creature that consumed nuclear waste in the Tokyo Bay in the 1950s, and eventually developed into what we see as Godzilla here. The rapid evolution caused by nuclear waste consumption eventually causes it to adapt and come to shore, causing destruction and terror on mainland Japan. But not on purpose this time. Anno flipped the original concept of Godzilla on its head, and this monster isn't out to punish humanity for its wrongdoings. In Godzilla's eyes, it's simply fighting to exist, and it's simply too big and too powerful to coexist with humanity. Like Destroya, we're going to throw the original card completely out the window, but this one we're going to maintain some of the concepts from the original. I like that the original card feels like a looming threat with its cycling interaction, but I want to push this concept further, both mechanically and aesthetically, to really hit home the flavor of this version of Godzilla. I wanted to figure out the most elegant way to show that he's an omen on the battlefield and that he's going to show up whether players want him to or not, and completely warp the battlefield around him when he does arrive. I was inspired by Greater Gargadon, a card from Time Spiral that has a really low cost to suspend, but has a lot of suspend counters, and it's this massive creature, and it'll let you sack permanents in order to remove time counters to speed up the process. So Godzilla Doom Inevitable won't have a casting cost, and instead it will have suspend 7. I picked 7 because odd numbers looked weird to me, and I want this thing to be unsettling. We'll make his color identity black and red, as the green to represent the nature of Godzilla feels completely absent here, and its suspend cost will just be a black and a red. You can speed up the process and remove time counters from him by sacrificing an artifact, creature, or land. Let's raise the power and toughness to 9/9 as well, and instead of haste and trample, we're going to give him trample and indestructible, as he doesn't feel particularly fast, but he definitely feels unkillable. The most memorable scene in Shin Godzilla is when he fires his atomic breath for the first time, so I definitely wanted to showcase that here. When he finally enters or when he attacks, he does 3 damage to each creature and each player. Yes, even himself. I really wanted to hit this home both mechanic and flavor-wise, so I centered his name and caps locked it, as well as the flavor text. And the flavor text itself is a reference to a teaser poster, which is maybe the hardest poster I've ever seen in my life. And that about wraps up my take on the Godzilla series. This franchise means kind of a lot to me, probably about as much as Magic these days. I hope some of the theory and explanations behind the changes I made to these cards will inspire those that haven't to check out the Godzilla films. This franchise really does have a lot to offer beyond monster fights, and I really encourage you to check it out if you haven't. I don't think I would be making this video, or Godzilla would be still going strong to this day if it were just about the monster fights. Let me know who your favorite kaiju is in the comments if you have one, and I will see you next time. If you guys want the versions of these cards that I made, let me know in the comments and I'll add them to the description. Until next time, I have been Foxherder and you have been wonderful.